Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for Startup Boston Week and for Fair is Fair, utilizing competency-based interviewing to reduce hiring bias. Bias is one of those topics that makes most people feel at least a little bit stressed out. So before we begin, I'd like to invite you to do a movement exercise with me that will help calm those fight, flight, or freeze, maybe fawn things that are going on inside of you. So this exercise is like 2 to 4 minutes long, and we're just going to move our head, our arms, and our legs a little bit. If you're tuning in virtually, you can do this at home, or if you don't mind looking a little silly in your fishbowl office, you can do it in the office. But if for any reason you don't want to or aren't able to stand and participate, a lot of this can be done sitting down. Feel free to do that. And if you just don't want to participate, there is no penalty or judgment for nonconformity here, so that is fine too. But I'm going to step off the podium for a moment. And for anybody who would like to join, please stand with me. So we're going to start by just turning our head left, and turning our head right. And when you do it, really point your chin in the direction you're turning your head and feel that neck stretch. And keep your shoulders back and down. You've been sitting all day yesterday or in the car today. And then look down and look up. And again, point your chin. Make sure you feel that stretch. Thank you. I've never done this with a microphone. That's less relaxing. All right. And now tilt your head to the side, ear to shoulder. Other side, other side, other side. And then reach both arms way up high. Reach towards the ceiling. Reach towards the sun that's above the clouds. Excellent. And then you're going to put your arms behind your back and just give yourself kind of a little self-massage. Do it with both hands. Right there, up and down at the lower of your spine. All right, and then if you have anxiety, you can do this anytime, not just here, but with both hands. You want to do gorilla thumps on your chest. Yeah, excellent. And when you talk, it should sound like you're breathing through a fan if you're doing it right. And then I'm going to set the mic down for the last part, but I'll tell you what we're going to do first. If you have chronic pain issues, please sit this one out. But we are going to be tapping or lightly smacking our arms and legs up and down for a count of 3 down and 3 up, right? So you'll go, start on your left arm, and up, switch to the right, and then all the way down your body, and back up, and then move on your hips a little bit, and then back up, and then do your arms again, and back down. You can do it at your own speed. You don't have to keep up with me. I'm very short. If you're tall, it might take you longer. Down your arms one last time. And down your body, down your legs. Feet on your hips one last time. And then pull it down. Put your hands over your heart. Take a big breath in. And think about something you're grateful for today while you're I'm very grateful that all of you are here today. So thank you so much. All right. Thank you all so much for doing that with me. Very fun. My name is Ivy Blossom. I run a talent acquisition consultancy called Ivy Blossom Recruits. And today I want to share a tale with you that mirrors the journey of countless startups in their pursuit of success. So allow me to introduce you to our fictional startup, Technova. Technova is a startup that just secured its Series C funding and is a rising star in the aerospace scene. In the heart of Boston, Technova is embarking on its mission to innovate, disrupt, and carve its place among giants like SpaceX, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin. As happens at fictional tech startups, the energy was palpable, the vision was crystal clear, and the team was eager to conquer new horizons, driven by passion and caffeine. As the startup's momentum grew, so did its need for exceptional talent. The hiring engine roared to life, fueled by dreams, determination, and Doritos. So let's walk with Technova through the chapters of their story. This is my drive in today, maybe a little bit less sunny. Did any of you sit in traffic too? Technova's story is a story of bias conquered, talent unearthed, and a startup that had the audacity to evolve into an organization that saw 45% of its revenue come from innovation, all by harnessing the power of competency based interviewing to conquer bias in its hiring process. After securing their Series C funding, Boston aerospace startup Technova did a lot of hiring, as you do when you get a new round of funding. And 6 months later, their revenue started dropping and their competitiveness in the market started to backslide. Their new employees just weren't contributing to the company in the way the hiring committees had expected. And despite their best efforts, Technova's founders just could not figure out the root cause of their problems. The founders at Technova were not ones to back down, though. They hired a talent acquisition consultant to investigate and create a strategy to overcome the problem. Remember now, this is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental. The talent acquisition consultant that they hired helped them understand that the best way to build revenue is through innovation, and that statistically, innovation does not happen by hiring the most brilliant people. It happens by building the most diverse teams composed of individuals who have strong competencies relevant to their roles and functions. Don't just take the talent acquisition consultant's word for it, though. Research from the World Economic Forum speaks volumes. They found that companies that champion diversity drive innovation and revenue. Those with above average diversity scores see 45% of their revenue come from innovation, and those that have below average diversity scores see only 26% of their revenue come from innovation. Prior to learning this, Technova had been using an unstructured interview process and hired people based on their work history, their potential, their passion, and their cultural fit. Sound familiar? Um, and equipped with this new information about diversity driving innovation and innovation driving revenue, Technova recognized the need to break free from the gravitational pull of conventional interviewing. Traditional questions like, tell me about your startup experience. Do you enjoy working in a fast-paced environment? What would you do if you had a tight deadline and limited resources and weren't sure you could make it all come together? Just aren't capable of resulting in the diverse hiring needed for Technova to outshine its competition. The consultant also taught them the 10 most common employee selection problems, which are: pressure to fill the position quickly affects the hiring team's judgment. Interviewers don't have an organized approach. They talk too much and listen too little. Biases, stereotypes, and the ladder of inference affect judgment. Interviewers take insufficient notes and don't use scorecards, which is problematic because poor documentation gives the first and the last candidates the advantage simply because interviewers remember them better than the ones in between. Interviewers ask leading questions like, do you enjoy working on teams? Interviewers make snap decisions. Hiring discussions are not systematic. Interviewers either don't meet to discuss the candidate, or when they do meet, the data shared is superficial. Have you been in an interview debrief before and had someone say, she seemed smart? Or, I don't think he'll be a good cultural fit, but I can't quite put my finger on why. And lastly, the hiring team doesn't know where they fall on the intercultural development curriculum. Sorry, continuum. So this is the intercultural development continuum, and most people aren't super familiar with this. The IDI assesses intercultural competence, which is the capability to shift cultural perspectives and appropriately adapt your behavior to cultural differences and commonalities. It allows you to unlock and leverage innovation and collaboration and improve performance within your organization. So currently, the current version of the IDI is like a 50-item questionnaire that measures intercultural competence along the intercultural development continuum. This slide came off of a DEI coach's website, who's a friend of mine. His name is Kai. He's delightful. But you can also find information about this on the IDI website, or we can talk about it later at the bar crawl if you like. But consider how you understand, like you as an individual here in the audience today, think about how you understand and behave toward people from other cultures who think and act differently than you. The IDI describes these ways of thinking, feeling, and responding to cultural differences in terms of 5 core intercultural competence mindsets and behaviors. So these range from the monocultural perspectives of denial and polarization. Then there's the transitional mindset of minimization and the intercultural or global mindsets of acceptance and adaptation. So when you look at this, take a moment and think, what do you think your own primary orientation is? Research indicates you would probably not be very accurate. Does this surprise you from your giggles? Probably not. IDI results show that people typically overestimate their own intercultural competence. After all, for lots of people, it's a natural human tendency to see ourselves as more capable than others might view us, or as more competent than we actually are. And this tendency to overrate our own abilities, it can have positive effects like having stretch goals that we're reaching for that we might not otherwise achieve. But when it comes to being interculturally effective, which is what you're striving for in your interviews here to reduce your bias, this can be a blind spot where we think we're more adaptable to cultural diversity than we actually are. So let's take a closer look at each of the 5 intercultural mindsets and behaviors. And you can tell me if you've heard any of these things or think to yourself about whether or not you've heard any things of these things come from yourself, come from your colleagues, come from your former colleagues. So we'll start at denial, which sees the differences between cultures, but doesn't really recognize deeper cultural patterns. For instance, in cultural conflict resolution styles, this person may avoid or withdraw from interaction with people from different cultures. So, a denial orientation often reflects limited experiences living in other countries and thinks it's really important for newly hired diverse members to fit into the organization. However, denial may not equally value diverse approaches that are not familiar. As a result, diverse individuals can feel unsupported and ignored. Um, I should take a moment and say here, I should not have phrased it like that because an individual cannot be diverse, only a group can. So I will from now on just be saying an underrepresented person or a person from an underrepresented group. That was old language. Thanks. um, but a key developmental step is to focus conscious attention and learning on observing cultural differences that might be escaping notice. So I'll give you an example of something you might hear from someone who has a denial orientation. Robert is the business manager for Technova. He's worked for them for about 6 months, but prior to this, he had worked at the same US company for his whole career. Robert's developmental orientation is in denial. And here's an example of a panel interview where things really went off the rails. Robert was running this interview, and the candidate was from an Eastern culture. He was Chinese. And the Chinese individual was not making eye contact with Robert. And Robert got very upset about this and actually pointed it out to the individual in front of the rest of the members of the panel that he was not making eye contact, that he should be making eye contact, and that he was being disrespectful by not making eye contact. Afterwards, the consultant had a really interesting discussion with Robert. And it was interesting because Robert didn't see any problem. They shouldn't be focusing on culture. Culture shouldn't have anything to do with it. This is about respect. And when Robert's boss wanted to talk to him about this situation and some others that were going wrong, he said, Robert, we're really doing this initiative because we need to become much more interculturally competent. And Robert insisted that he was wrong. This was about respect. And this attitude of not wanting to deal with cultural differences really put Robert in a very bad position at Technova for a while. All right, next up, we've got polarization. Polarization comes in two forms. The first form is defense, and the second form is reversal. I'll give you a quick example of both. So polarization sees cultural differences from a more judgmental viewpoint, and that can take the form of us versus them. This is true for both aspects of polarization. One form is defense, which is characterized by having an uncriticalness towards one's own cultural values and practices, and an overly critical view toward other cultural practices. Cultural difference in this form is seen as an obstacle to overcome, divisive, maybe threatening. Someone in a defense orientation might even feel under siege from diversity. Now, other people can perceive this mindset as a sense of superiority towards the values and practices of culturally different groups. So, this can happen because of an overemphasis on negative differences towards other groups and less attention on the commonalities that exist across the cultures. In organizations, defense may show up as the company training newly hired underrepresented groups on how things are done around here, without equal support of how different experiences and skills can be better included in the organization. On the reversal side, reversal is an overly critical view towards one's own group and an uncritical view toward the practices of other communities. So this can lead to an idealization of some cultures and their way of life. Like I said, it also takes an us versus them view, but in this case, other groups are the good guys and my culture is the bad guy. Reversal can also actively support the cause of an underrepresented group, but this is done with little deeper understanding of what the other group's cause really means to the members of that group. So when polarization is present, people from underrepresented groups often feel uncomfortable, as do people from overly represented or most commonly represented groups. And people from non-dominant cultures might experience a sense of bias in the form of their contributions going unrecognized. So here's an example of someone who views cultural differences from a defense orientation. Marisol was born and raised in a large city in eastern Spain. She was raised, and these are her words, in a very traditional Spanish family. She was raised with three brothers and describes her father as patriarchal. She's at polarization that takes the form of defense. Marisol is in charge of sales enablement at Technova. And Technova offers this really cool program where their American salespeople can spend 3 months in their office in Spain to get exposure to other aspects of the organization, and vice versa. Employees from Spain can spend 3 months in the American office. The basic orientation that Marisol has, though, is not helpful to the Gen Z business development representatives that she's working with from the US, especially the women. She regards the behavior of young US women as scandalous. She says that they are making themselves to be sex objects, that they dress inappropriately, that they share information inappropriately on their Facebook pages. She is appalled at their behavior. And she really doesn't understand also why employees won't embrace some of the, to use her words, traditions of Spanish culture. So, for example, she is a lover of the bullfights. And while she understands that there are people who don't like bullfights, she cannot understand why there are employees who refuse to go to a bullfight. So she's polarizing tremendously. She polarizes anything that the US transfer employees do that reminds her of the issues that she had trouble with when she lived in the US briefly several years ago. Those issues are things like consumerism, US foreign policy, the fact that after 6 p.m., she thinks nobody is on the streets. She finds Gen Z Americans to be boring in conversation. They're not engaged enough. They don't know anything about Spanish culture. They can't speak intelligently with their Spanish colleagues in the language, and on and on and on. So the issue really is her affect, which is just profoundly polarizing. The world consists of them and us, and she's put herself in an embattled situation. On the other side, there's polarization in the form of reversal. So we'll take a look at John now, who operates from this orientation. John is a very senior level executive at Technova. He is a white, middle aged male. His orientation, like I said, is polarization in the form of reversal. So, John served on a number of boards that were primarily advocacy organizations for people of color, and he served as a sponsor for some of the employee resource groups for the LGBTQ community, and he saw himself as a champion for diversity and inclusion. And he was very intolerant of anybody who didn't get it. And so, if they didn't get it, they were wrong. They were jerks. And so John was such a strong advocate for this. This is the right way to go. Diversity is the right way to go. And everybody needs to understand that this is what we need to do. But he wasn't inclusive of the people who, for whatever reason, didn't agree with him or didn't get it. And when you're not inclusive of those people, they're very unlikely to ever progress through this continuum. So he was advocating for the underrepresented. And that's where his reversal came in, because in a very absolute way, he had taken on the cause of these other groups. Next, we've got minimization. You can see minimization is where most companies are stuck, 66% of them. And you'll hear probably a lot of things that echo if you're in like a Series C or a Series D startup, where you are today. So minimization is a transitional mindset between monocultural and intercultural mindsets. It's an orientation that highlights cultural commonalities across diverse groups, but it only looks for the commonalities, and doing that can mask deeper recognition and understanding of cultural differences. So it can be effective across cultures for trivial things that, where commonalities are useful to the task at hand and adapting to differences isn't really required. We all fill out a spreadsheet pretty much the same way. But this orientation struggles when common policies are not sufficient for bridging across diverse groups. When this happens, the minimization orientation and the people in it find it challenging to deeply understand the other cultural perspectives and to engage in adaptive behavior. So for dominant group members, minimization leads to lack deeper cultural self-awareness, including awareness around power and privilege. For non-dominant group members, minimization is often more of a strategy to adjust to the dominant culture's values and practices. For example, a go along to get along strategy. So there is a strength to this perspective, as there is to every one of these. Its focus is on eliminating bias, prejudice, and discrimination. And this is done by establishing policies and practices that help assure equal opportunity for all. Now, these efforts clearly improve cross-cultural relations, but they do not address how to adapt to diverse perspectives or behaviors. And as a result, diverse perspectives and experiences aren't typically fully heard. So here is an example of someone with a minimization dominant culture orientation. Suzanne is Technova's very first health and wellness employee. She works for both offices, the one in the US and the one in Spain. She's a minimization from a dominant culture perspective. And she feels that she's very intercultural because, in her words, she deals with cultures all the time. Of course, I'm intercultural. I work with both offices. But when the talent acquisition consultant listens to Suzanne, it becomes apparent that she's dealing with those other cultures from a perspective of her own. She's not questioning or learning about the cultures themselves. She's just helping that person or those people from that culture. So one of the things about Suzanne that she's really good at is looking at how things are similar across cultures. So from a health and wellness standpoint, drinking alcohol together is often seen as a bonding activity across the cultures she's working with. That's one of her strengths. She can see the commonalities across the cultures. Where her effectiveness is impacted is when she's not considering some of the cultural nuances or some of the differences of how people look at the different aspects of what health benefits alcohol has, or what's happening with alcohol abuse across cultures, or things that are other things that are happening in those cultures around the same thing. So here's an example on the other side of someone who views cultural differences from a minimization, non-dominant orientation. Doug is in his early 40s, and he's the director of engineering at Technova. Doug is a non dominant group person, and he frames his world from that perspective. And what I mean when I say this is that when Doug found out that minimization was his primary orientation and learned what that meant, his answer was, "You're right. I am in minimization, and that is exactly where I want to be. It is exactly where I want to stay." He said, "I'm a big black guy. When I come in the room, everybody can see I'm different. I don't want them to see that I'm different. I want them to see me as the same as them. I don't want to be threatening in any way, and this is what works for me." He said, "This is probably one of the reasons that I got to where I am today. I put people at ease by focusing on the similarities, and I don't talk about the differences." So, Doug and the talent acquisition consultant discussed the other side of this and some of the downsides of the worldview orientation of minimization. And the consultant said to him, "Might there be times when you have a different idea about how to approach something and you don't bring it up because you don't want to highlight your differences? You don't want to tell the story about why you think that? Perhaps the majority of people in the room in a meeting want to go one direction, but you think there's a better or a different way to approach it and you just don't bring it up." And he said, "You're right. That does happen. I pretty much go along to get along." So Doug recognizes that this limits him from bringing his entire contribution to the organization as an individual. He's not as creative or as innovative as he might be because of it, right? But how is this affecting his team? Well, he's not recognizing some of the differences that his team members bring because he supports this conformity worldview as well. And so he really wants everybody to be on the same page. He uses a lot of phrases like, you're gonna be really surprised here, "We all have to be on the same page." Um, "Let's march forward. We're all in this together. We're all the same. We all have the same goal." And in the end, Doug did agree that he does lead that way. He wants people to conform. Conformity does not generate revenue, just so we're all clear. So, as we move along the continuum, we arrive at acceptance. Acceptance recognizes and appreciates cultural differences and commonalities, but it's challenged to appropriately adapt to differences in the workplace. So, this is a lot. I feel like a lot of employee resource groups get stuck in this stage. Um, Acceptance is often a strong advocate for deeper understanding and developing more effective culturally responsive practices. But what those practices are is difficult to identify, and it's harder still to act in appropriately adaptive ways. The result is that underrepresented employees might feel understood, but not fully engaged. So here's an example of someone who views cultural differences from an acceptance orientation. Nancy is a white woman in her 50s. She's a senior HR leader at Technova. In her previous roles, she's had some short term assignments, not long ones, like 3 to 6 month kind of assignments outside of the US, and her primary orientation is acceptance. Managers often come to her for advice. They say things like, "Nancy, this person is not performing well." And Nancy knew the right kinds of questions to ask to say, "Is this really a performance issue? Have you thought about this? Or perhaps there's something else going on that might be culturally related." She was really good at pulling that out and helping people to reframe what a problem might be. "Oh, this really isn't a performance issue. There's something else going on here." So she was great at asking the right questions. And she was great at helping other people who might be at minimization or polarization or denial along the continuum. But when it came down to it, Nancy did not have a clue about what to do when it came to bridging the divide between those differences. So the talent acquisition consultant asked Nancy how she was navigating the differences. And Nancy said, "Well, I made a lot of presentation to the senior leaders." And then she revealed that she was pretty much putting the onus on the senior leaders to do something about it. And the consultant said, "Well, Nancy, do you feel like the senior leaders are responsible for coming up with the solutions?" And Nancy said, "Yes, they're the leaders. They're above me. That's their role." And the consultant said, "Do you feel like those leaders are culturally competent enough to actually come up with some of the adaptive solutions that you're looking for?" And Nancy said, I'd never really thought about that." All right, last up, We've got adaptation, which is the global mindset. Adaptation is being able to shift perspective and change behavior in culturally appropriate ways. So, people in adaptation typically have substantial experience with diversity and have internalized a wealth of behaviors that effectively bridge across differences. People in adaptation often see their role as demanding high levels of intercultural competence. You might hear other coaches or other people call it performance and adaptation. Domestic and international differences in this form are used as a resource in multicultural teams and within the organization as a whole. The result is that diversity feels valued, involved, and engaged in the mission and in the work of the organization. So here's an example of someone who views cultural differences from an adaptation mindset. Cynthia is the only lawyer at Technova. She's 47 years old and Scottish. She was brought up in Scotland in a monocultural home and has now lived in the US working for Technova for a few years. She's in adaptation. So Technova was working on a merger and acquisition with a company from the East. Technova started to have some problems when it came to how they were presenting contracts and the communication around those contracts. So Cynthia was really good at finding some of these mutually adapted solutions and helped them bridge from the US perspective to the Chinese perspective, which is where the organization was located. She knew you had to handle contracts differently. She knew that the communication style was very different from direct to indirect communication. She didn't judge the other company for that. There was no penalty for it. She just adapted to it. She became quite perceptive and really good at finding those solutions to help bridge this merger and acquisition so much better. So, when you're looking to reduce bias in your hiring process, it's really important not to jump immediately to the solution of competency-based interviewing, because every single person on that interview team falls somewhere different on the intercultural development continuum. And knowing where you fall on this continuum is key to understanding how you're interviewing might be limiting the diversity and innovation of your interviews, your hiring process, your onboarding, and your retention levels. Whoops, one too far. There we go. So the IDI, as we just talked about, identifies where individuals, groups, and organizations are on that developmental continuum versus where they think they are. This orientation, can you see speakers notes up there, or is that chat? Chat, awesome. I was like, I'm not sticking in my speaker's notes. Don't read those. This orientation gap is the degree to which one overestimates or underestimates their level of intercultural competence. So knowing how you deal with cultural differences and commonalities is crucial for your own growth and also to reduce hiring bias in your hiring process. So hiring bias happens when part of the applicant review process is influenced by candidate traits and information that are not relevant to the job. Based on what you just learned about the intercultural development continuum, you can see how that problem could creep in unnoticed, right? Competency-based interviewing is one of the best ways to engage in fair and equitable hiring practices and can act like a shield against objectivity when paired with structured interviews and standardized evaluation criteria. So Technova's talent acquisition consultant helped the company map the core competencies that align with their roles and company values so that the hiring team could go beyond the stereotypes and see a candidate's true potential. Now, a competency is not the same as a job description or a bullet point in a job description. So think about the job description for a waiter, and then think about the competencies somebody needs to have to be a good waiter. Sure, you need to be able to carry a plate, but you also need to be good at talking to people. Sure, you need to be able to tell the difference between a Coke and a Sprite, but you also need to have a decent memory and be able to remember to follow up with people and ask if they need anything else. So expand your view of what a competency is by just a little bit. So the consultant also taught them that part of the human condition is jumping on the ladder of inference. When this is all of us, 100% of us, I'm not making a broad sweeping generalization by accident. When we interview people, we cannot help but form an initial impression of them and then start to look for evidence that supports that impression. This is called the ladder of inference. To combat this, every interviewer needs to look for evidence that contradicts their initial impression of the candidate. And after a little practice, the startup discovered that competency based interviewing was not just a beacon, but really a lifeline that rescued them from the depths of assumption and groupthink. So, Technova's transformation rippled through its hiring process. This shift transcended the hypothetical answers that the hiring teams had been getting from the candidates. And since the company had gone through the IDI evaluation and training, the ripple effect helped ensure that every candidate's full spectrum of capabilities was embraced and evaluated. Competency-based interviews look for previous demonstrable evidence of the candidate's technical and soft skills. Then you can determine if the level of their skills and know-how is appropriate for the job. The questions are all structured similarly. They are non-leading, tell me about a time when questions. Common competency interview questions that startups use are: give an example of a moment when you had a time-pressured assignment and how you completed it on time and on budget. Tell me about a time when you used your creativity to solve a problem. Describe a time you've revealed meaningful insights from a large volume of data. And give an example of a time when you led a team through a period of change. Great. Just like space explorers push the boundaries of the unknown, Technova's new competency-based approach empowered candidates to show the true impact they had at their former companies. For customer success managers, the age-old, tell us about how you handle difficult customer interactions, was elevated to tell us about a scenario where you proactively identified a customer's pain points, led a team to resolve it, and discovered a solution to retain the customer. For product owners, can you create a roadmap? Became tell us about the last time you worked cross-functionally to build a roadmap. For software engineers, the question, and this is a real question somebody I know was recently asked in a software engineering interview. Explain the concept of cloud computing to my older, not very technical mother. Became, give us an overview of the last time you had to explain something technically complex, like the cloud, to a not very technical person in a professional setting. And for executive roles, the commonplace, what's your leadership style and how do you define success, became, tell me about a time when your strategic vision propelled your team through uncharted territory, resulting in a groundbreaking product launch. Now, we know that one of the benefits of competency-based interviewing is reducing bias in the hiring process. So it's really important to keep in mind that traditionally underserved groups may not have the same level of access to reliable interview strategy or interview training information as some other groups do, which means that they might not be as great of an interviewer. But here's the thing about hiring. You are not trying to hire a great interviewer. You're trying to hire a great software engineer or a great product owner or a great FP&A person. And not every candidate is going to know or remember that the best way to answer competency-based interview questions, or really any interview question, is by using the STAR method. STAR stands for situation, tasks, actions, results. So Technova's talent acquisition consultant taught the hiring teams that during their interview introduction, the first 3 to 5 minutes that you're talking to the candidate, they should remind candidates that they're looking for the STAR answer structure. And if candidates are still struggling, Technovians can ask non-leading, probing follow-up questions. For example, if the question is, tell me about a time in your last job when you really pleased a customer, they might ask follow-up questions like, well, tell me more about the situation. What were you tasked with? Who tasked you with it? What actions did the team take? And what actions did you specifically take as an individual? Can you walk me through what happened next? Notice that does not say, were you successful? That's a leading question. How did you react? What was the result? By following this formula, Technova's new competency-based selection process was set to enhance the consistency of evaluating candidates, the quality of their new hires, and the company's diversity level. But oh no, as so often happens with change, resistance popped up almost immediately, before the talent acquisition consultant had even finished the training. Technovians were worried. Would hiring for current competencies eliminate the ability to hire for potential, which is what the company was built on? Would it ruin the company culture by allowing a bunch of highly competent jerks through the door? But don't fret. Technova's talent acquisition consultant had a plan for this too. She taught Technovians how to weave behavioral and motivational interviewing into their structured process. Traditional interview questions are estimated to be predictive of on the job performance about 10% of the time. I'll say that just in case you weren't listening. Traditional interview questions are estimated to be predictive of on the job performance about 10% of the time. Can you imagine 10% effectiveness in your interviewing? Competency-based and behavioral-based interviewing are estimated to be predictive of on-the-job performance about 55% of the time. Unlike competency-based interview questions, behavioral and motivational interview questions are asked to establish if a candidate has the character traits required to align with the mission and the values of the organization. They are not asked to determine whether or not that candidate makes you comfortable to be around. There are no right or wrong answers to behavioral and motivational questions. When you ask these questions, you're asking the candidate to tell you a story of how they did something and why. And this allows you to understand why they behave the way they do and if their working style will add value to the organization, not if they're a person you would enjoy working with, not if they're a person who makes me comfortable in conversation. This is one of the keys to hiring for cultural value add instead of cultural fit. The interviewer should look for examples of past behavior that demonstrate the candidate's working style. So common behavioral interview questions are things like, tell me about a time you failed. This is my personal favorite interview question. I ask it in every interview. If you have an interview coming up, you should prepare for a question like that. If you're not currently asking it, please start and let me know how it goes for you. They also ask things like, tell me about a time you disagreed with a manager. Tell me about a time you had to make an important decision quickly and without all the information you needed. None of us have ever had to do that in a startup, right? And some insightful motivational questions are, what are 2 characteristics of your last company that annoy you? What are 2 characteristics of your last job that make you happy? And what are 2 things from your last role that you were happy to avoid? And lastly, what are 2 characteristics missing from your most recent role that you would like to be included in your next one? That'll help you a little bit with retention and engagement in those first 90 days. Now, I'm sure that you can see how, if you're unaware of where you fall on the intercultural development continuum, the answers to some of these questions could lead you down the wrong path. So again, it is really important to assess where your hiring teams are on the continuum and ensure that they're following the roadmap to move from monocultural to intercultural mindsets. You might be wondering how Technova structured each 1-hour interview. Their talent acquisition consultant taught them to use the first 5 to 7 minutes to establish rapport with the candidates and get general background information. Take 5 minutes to lay out the interview agenda. This is where you should describe how long the interview will last, tell the candidate what to do if they need to use the restroom, explain that to the candidate that they can ask questions toward the end, and let them know that you'll be taking notes. If you're not taking notes, please start. And also that you're looking for, tell me about a time when questions to be answered with the STAR method. Spend 30 to 40 minutes to obtain competency, behavioral, and motivational information. Then spend 5 to 10 minutes to describe the role and the company. Notice this happens at the end, not at the beginning, so you're not leading the candidate to the answers you want to hear through your description. And then at the end, allow 5 to 10 minutes for the candidate to ask questions and around 3 minutes to close. You can adjust this appropriately for 45-minute interviews, for 30-minute interviews, and so on. So Technovians also got to learn effective communication techniques for conducting interviews and increasing the likelihood that candidates will accept job offers. A few of these techniques include complimenting the candidate during the interview. This encourages them to continue providing in-depth examples. Interviews are scary. No matter how confident this person seems, please give them a compliment. You can say something as simple as, "That sounds like a really difficult situation. Congratulations on figuring out a solution." You can pause to allow the candidate time to answer the question instead of letting the period of silence result in a leading follow-up question from you by accident. So you can pause for up to 20 seconds and still have it be useful. After that 20-second mark, you might want to say, "Do you need some more time to think?" No other questions, though. And to signal that they are listening by empathizing with difficult situations and rephrasing what they hear to check that they've understood the answer correctly. So, with the fusion of competency, behavioral, and motivational-based interviewing, Technova made a massively positive shift in bias reduction, uncovering potential and mitigating the risk of hiring brilliant jerks. As they moved forward, their hiring engine propelled them toward a future where innovation reigned and diversity was the cosmic thread that wove their success. Technova's journey unveils a revelation that resonates through the startup cosmos. Competency-based interviewing is not just a process. It's a tool that leverages bias reduction to generate revenue. It's a force that, when harnessed alongside behavioral and motivational insights, propels startups out of their bootstraps and into the stars. Technova might be a fictional company, and this is a made-up story, but Technova's story is not confined to the make-believe. You are all charting your own course to the stars. If you want to leave your competition in the dust, or the stardust, so to speak, you'll need innovative teams to penetrate the market and launch your company to its rightful place in the Gartner Quadrant. Armed with competency-based interviewing, you'll have the tools to shape your startup universe in ways that defy the ordinary and sculpt your startup's destiny among the stars. Embrace the lessons of Technova, weave them into your own narrative, and have the audacity to embark on a journey where the sky is not the limit, it's just the beginning. And now I think we have a few minutes left for questions, right?
Absolutely.
Great.
So what we'll go ahead and do is we have our in-person audience, and then we have our virtual audience as well. So I'm going to toggle back and forth. I would love to start it off with an in-person question if anyone has one. If not, happy to defer to the virtual audience. I'm going to hand you the mic just so that way our virtual attendees are able to hear you, and then I'll grab it back whenever you're done. You're welcome.
Hi. What can a company or a team in general do in order to facilitate the transition on the continuum of all the people, basically, including the interviewers? So if one is assessed to be in the polarization stage, how can actually be helped? What are the practices? What are the suggestions to actually help transitioning toward the adaptation?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Thank you so much for asking. The IDI, the Intercultural Development Continuum, has a coaching service. So the coaches go through a lot of training to be able to come in, give a company an assessment, or even give an individual an assessment, maybe a team leader, something like that, help them identify where they are. It's very difficult for somebody to move along the continuum on their own without a coach because we're very bad at knowing where we start. Right. So you can hire an IDI coach to come in, evaluate your organization or evaluate you as an individual or a team member, or even a small team. And then once they understand, and we all fall a little bit into each of those categories, right? So when we talk about what space in the continuum are you on, that's really your primary orientation. We've all fall a little bit into each of those depending on the culture, right? But they will come in, assess where you are or where your team is, and then build you a roadmap that's usually 6 to 12 months. Some of it involves them working with you, other things do not. There are things like self-learning things that you can do on your own or exposure that you can have. But if you want to take it into your own hands, IDI training and a coach can be expensive, and some of us are working out of our garages still. So if you really want to take it into your own hands, assess where you think you fall on the scale, and then assume that you're one behind. And from there, say, well, if this is really where I am, what can I do to expose myself to more diverse cultures, to more diverse groups of thinking, in order to understand a little bit more, to both see those differences and see those commonalities and figure out how to bridge that gap. Another thing that you can do is look for a mentor. So if you have somebody that you know in the DEI space and you really believe that they are in one of those global mindsets at the end, connect with them, ask them to be your mentor. Go to networking groups that are very intercultural, go to meetup groups, get exposure, ask a lot of questions. And then the number one, also most expensive thing is travel.
Yeah. So would you, if I can ask another question, so based on your experience, would you say that the teams who are completely remote and work virtually are kind of less facilitated to transition because they are kind of their own space also physically, instead of sharing an office and be kind of physically close? Or based on your experience is not really a factor that?
Nobody's asked me that question yet. Hold on, let me think.
Well, yeah.
So I think it probably depends on how the company is handling remote work. Some companies are very good about handling remote work and still being able to bring people together a few times a year in person, or, remote team bonding exercises. I think remotely, it's even more difficult to understand where you fall on the continuum because you're placed in conflict resolution less. There's no, oh, I bumped into you in the kitchen and I want to continue this conversation. There's, oh, I got this annoying message from somebody on Slack and decided not to respond. That's very different, right? So I think that it definitely depends on how the company is going about it, but I believe that the progression through the continuum would be slower.
Yeah, okay. And probably helps to have a kind of like a program which is kind of trying to bring everyone, independently of on where they start, to transition. So it's kind of a, common project to move forward.
Absolutely. And it's not something that you learn once.
No,
right?
exactly.
It's something that you go and you can slide back too. I know people who have been on an adaptation because they were living internationally, they were traveling a lot for work, then their role changed. They moved back to the US, they weren't traveling anymore. And 10 years later, they were sliding back a little bit. They still understood the differences and valued them, but they didn't know how to bridge them anymore. Things like that.
I never thought about that. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I didn't want to steal the stage.
I'm just going to transition quickly to one of our virtual questions. We had someone submit one saying, for underrepresented folks, minimization is often a viable strategy, adopted because they don't or can't expect to be accepted when they, quote, get too comfortable. How then do we ensure organizations are ready to meet those who are being called to move outside of practice that is likely offering psychological safety?
That's a great question. Can you read the last half again when you got to the how then should we?
Yes. So it says, how then do we ensure organizations are ready to meet those who are being called to move outside of practice that was likely offering psychological safety?
Okay, so I'll start by telling you I'm a pretty loud representative of the LGBT community. When you meet me, I'm typically dressed in rainbows and have hot pink hair. It's hard to miss. And last night, or 2 days ago, without thinking about it, I dyed my hair and chose this very plain conservative outfit for this talk. And then as soon as I was done, I realized I had fallen into minimization. I was minimizing my differences because I wanted to appeal to the largest number of people who might hire me in the future as their consultant. And then I was like, shoot, that's not what I should be doing right now. So I understand the question, and there are much deeper levels than what I just described, obviously. Moving out of minimization from a non-dominant perspective is scary. That's why I dyed my hair. It's terrifying, and it's something that has to be driven from the top down. It cannot be driven from the bottom up because while you can make progress that way, you will never have that feeling of safety. It will always be, is my boss going to fire me? Is my boss's boss going to fire me? I'll never forget the day I showed up at work when my hair went from brown to green, and they went, "Do you change your hair a lot?" Or when I stopped wearing makeup because of a skin condition and I showed up and somebody said to me, and it was my boss, "You're not going to go all Erica Badu on us, are you?" It is not, it doesn't feel safe. And so it does have to be driven from the top down. And if the top isn't striving at least towards movement there. If you have an employee resource group, try to start there. If that employee resource group has a budget, they might be able to make some movement there to bring on a trainer themselves to get the understanding of the people at the top. Or you might want to take a real honest look as to whether or not it might be time to look for a new role at another company.
Hi, Ivy. Thanks for a great presentation. Tactically, for those of us starting to think about implementing competency-based interviewing, what are some of your recommendations in terms of thinking through, do I start with a requisition? Do I start with a team? Do I roll this all out at once? Do I start with specific champions? Like, can you kind of walk me through just some high-level thoughts on where we might want to dive in and start?
So I do recommend doing a phased rollout if your company is larger than 50 people. If you have a very small company, it does not necessarily make sense to do that. But if your company is larger than 50 people, I recommend you start with one department, do it there, or with one interview team if you have, somebody from a different department in each team, and get really practiced at it so that you can kind of, each organization has its own communication style and things like that. I don't start with the requisition because most people change the job description 4 times before you actually make the hire. But you know what role you're looking for, and presumably you know what level you're looking for. So get together as a group with the hiring committee and say, what are the competencies that make someone successful in this role? Not who here has been successful in this role in the past, not who have you worked with in the past who did really well. No, this is a different company, a different time, a different person. What are the competencies that will make someone successful in this role today? And how much capacity do we have to train someone who only has 80% of those competencies, or 90, or 60? After you establish what the competencies are, then you can go about creating those competency-based interview questions. Each interviewer should have 2 questions, not 5, not 1. In a 1-hour interview, each interviewer should have 2 questions that are competency-based, or 1 behavioral and 1 competency, but at least 2 tell me about a time when questions. And then it is not effective if you do not use a scorecard. Everyone should be required to fill out a scorecard before the end of the day and before they have a conversation with somebody else about the interview, because our conversations often unknowingly affect our impression of the person. So, and you always want to try to hold that debrief session within 2 business days. If it's a weekend, 1 business day of the interview. And your ranking system should be thumbs up or thumbs down, not in the middle. It can be a 1 through 3, 1 through 5, but in general, it should be thumbs up or thumbs down, not in the middle. And then for everyone who's a thumbs down, go around the room. Typically, what I do is have the person with the least power start. If the manager starts, if the CEO starts, everybody's going to conform to that point of view. Have the person with the least amount of power start. Have the intern start. And then go up the line and have everybody give their thoughts. Who's a thumbs down? And then, again, starting at the bottom, have everybody give their thoughts. Who was thumbs up? And then ask the question. If you were a thumbs down, is there a cultural reason why? Did something make you uncomfortable? If you're a thumbs up, why? Is there a cultural reason? Were you so comfortable that you just were like, yes, we should hire this person, but now maybe you're starting to think, are they actually going to bring anything new? Or is it just a repeat of a person we already have in this role? Does that help answer your question?
All right, wonderful. So that is unfortunately all the time that we have today. That being said, you know where to find Ivy. We've got the QR code up here. So definitely, I know that there are some unanswered questions. So definitely reach out to Ivy just to chat about this more. This is an incredibly important conversation. A lot of times I think folks skirt to the side because they're afraid of being wrong, but that is not an excuse to not progress forward and kind of be self-aware with where we're at and where we can go. So sincerely, thank you so much. This was amazing. And I do have a little bit of housekeeping as